On a Tuesday morning in late October, Mavis Colton sat at her kitchen table in Harlan Falls, Kentucky, and looked at the number her bank had sent her, $211.47. She did not look at it twice. She had already known what it would say before she opened the letter, the way you know bad weather by the particular stillness of the air before it arrives. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast, and the particular emptiness of a house where one person has recently become fewer. Outside, the maple in the side yard had gone the color of rust, and the leaves were coming down in the slow, indifferent way that October has of reminding you that things end whether you are ready or not. Mavis Colton had been married for 31 years to a man named Harlan Doss. Not the town. The town was Harlan Falls. The man was Harlan Doss, and until 11 months ago, she had believed she knew everything worth knowing about him. Harlan had been a millwright, not a famous trade, not one that gets spoken of at dinner tables or written up in the county paper. A millwright is the man who keeps the machinery of the world turning, who understands the language of iron and gear and load-bearing stone. And Harlan Doss had been one of the best in 3 counties, or so people told Mavis after he was gone. She had not known that while he was alive. What she had known was the grease that never fully came off his hands, the hours he kept that made no sense, the money that was always just enough and never more than that, and the old grist mill on Cutter Creek that he had spent the better part of their marriage pouring himself into like a man, determined to fill something that had no bottom. The mill had belonged to his grandfather. It sat at the bend of Cutter Creek where the water ran fast enough to turn a wheel, 3 miles outside of town on a road that flooded every spring. It had not ground grain commercially in 40 years. The wheel was warped and green with moss. The stone floor inside was cracked. Half the roof had gone soft. And every weekend that Harlan was not working somewhere else, he was out there, doing something Mavis could never quite name, with tools she did not understand, to a building she had never once set foot inside. She resented the mill the way you resent a rival you cannot argue with because it has never once spoken a word. Harlan never tried to explain it to her. She never asked because asking felt like admitting it mattered, and she had decided early in the marriage that the mill was one of those things a wife learns to outlast. She was a practical woman. She kept the books for the dental office on Route 9. She raised their 2 children. She made the money stretch in the quiet and capable way of women who have learned to treat every dollar as a decision. And every Saturday, Harlan Doss drove his truck down the flooded road to a falling-down mill and came home after dark with dirt on his boots and sawdust in his hair and something in his eyes she could not read. 31 years. She had been patient with him for 31 years. He died in August, a Wednesday the way ordinary men die. Not heroically, not at the mill, but in the parking lot of the hardware store in town, his heart stopping between the truck door and the entrance, one hand still holding the receipt for 3 pounds of wood screws and a new drill bit. He was 66 years old. The doctor said it was fast. Mavis nodded at that the same way you nod at information that is technically kind and practically useless. The funeral surprised her. Not the size of it, because Harlan had lived his whole life in Harlan Falls, and people came out of obligation and habit, and the particular decency of small towns. What surprised her was the silence of it. Not the polite silence of mourning, a different kind. The silence of people who know something and have not decided yet whether to say it. A few left things at the grave she could not account for. A man she didn't recognize left a carved wooden wedge, the kind used to brace millstones. An older woman left a folded piece of paper she did not open until she got home, and when she did, it only said, "He kept it running, we never told him thank you, no signature." Mavis turned the note over twice, looking for a name. There wasn't one. 3 weeks after the funeral, the estate lawyer gave her the will. Harlan Doss left his wife everything he had, house, the truck, the tools, and the Doss mill on Cutter Creek, being the timber frame grist mill structure and associated water rights on the parcel at County Road 7, assessed by the county at a property value of $0 and no cents due to structural deficiency and floodplain classification. $0. Mavis set the paper on the kitchen table and sat with it a long time. He had left her the mill, the one thing she had spent 31 years resenting. He had left her the mill at $0 on a road that flooded every spring, as if it were a gift. Tucked behind the will, paper clipped to it with a clip that had left a rust mark on the corner, was another document she did not understand. It was dense with legal language, notarized, recorded at the county courthouse. She read it 3 times and understood perhaps a third of it. What she understood was this: The mill was not merely a mill. According to this document, it carried something called a Historic Preservation Covenant, placed voluntarily by Harlan Doss, recorded April 3, 2009 in the County Land Registry. Mavis read that date again, 2009. 14 years ago, she folded the paper, she looked out the window, and for the first time in 31 years, she wondered whether the man who drove that flooded road every Saturday had been driving somewhere other than the place she thought he was going. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the bed they had shared for 3 decades and let the questions come in the slow way they do when you are trying not to ask them. She had spent 31 years building a picture of Harlan Doss in her mind, a good man, a quiet man, a man whose judgment she had trusted in most things and doubted in one. The mill. She had doubted him about the mill. She had watched the money go into it. Not much money, never more than they could afford to lose. She had made sure of that. But time and attention and the best hours of his weekends, and she had consoled herself with the belief that every man needed one foolish thing to love. The mill was his. She had allowed it the way you allow a harmless vice, with tolerance and a quiet and enduring incomprehension. But a notarized covenant recorded at the courthouse was not the act of a man with a foolish hobby. It was the act of a man with a plan that was 14 years old and that she had known nothing about. If she had been wrong about that, she asked herself in the dark, what else had she been wrong about? The next morning, Mavis Colton put on her work boots, got in the truck, and drove the 3 miles down County Road 7 to the Doss Mill for the first time in her life. The road was worse than she'd imagined. Even in October, dry month, the ruts were deep enough to jolt her teeth. The trees came in close on both sides, the light coming through them in pieces, and the smell changed as she got closer. Wood smoke and creek water, and something older underneath, the smell of stone that has been wet for 100 years. She came around the last bend and saw it. She had imagined a ruin. What she saw was something stranger than a ruin, a building that should have been a ruin but wasn't. The structure was old, certainly. The timber framing was dark with age, the stone foundation mossy at the base. But the roof was new, or new enough, 10-15 years at most. And the wheel, she had expected the wheel to be rotted away. Instead it turned. Slowly, in the October current it turned. Its paddles were bright wood, recently replaced, unpainted, the grain still pale and clean. And the building itself, the door hung straight. The window frames were intact. The stone path from the road to the door was clear of weeds and swept. Mavis stood in the road and looked at a building that her husband had been quietly, patiently restoring for 31 years, and she understood with a force that surprised her that she had never, not once, asked him what he was doing out here. She had assumed. She had resented the assumption. But she had never asked. The door was unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. Harlan Doss had never locked anything in his life. She used to argue with him about that. Inside smelled of cedar and iron and linseed oil. The main floor was a single large room, stone-floored, the ceiling open to the beams above. The great millstone sat in the center, enormous and gray, and around it the machinery, gears, shafts, the wooden crown wheel connected to the water wheel outside, was clean, oiled, functional. On a workbench along the far wall, tools were laid out in the particular order of a man who intended to come back. He had not known he wasn't coming back. The tools were laid out for the next Saturday. Mavis sat down on the bench. She sat there a long time, the sound of the wheel turning outside, coming through the stone walls like a slow, patient heartbeat. And she thought about 31 years of Saturday absences, and what they had actually been. She thought about the winter he came home, with grease burns on his forearm, and told her he'd caught it on a pipe at work, and she'd been angry because he hadn't been careful. She wondered now whether it had been the mill machinery. She thought about the spring he was 3 hours late coming home, and she'd sat at the kitchen table with a cold supper, and a fury she hadn't let go of for a week. She could not now remember what excuse he had given. She remembered only the fury. She had spent 31 years being angry at a man who was not where she thought he was, doing what she thought he was doing, for the reasons she thought he had, and she had never once driven down a 3-mile road to find out. On a shelf above the workbench she found the books. Not ledgers exactly. Harlan Doss was not the kind of man who kept a ledger. He kept what she could only describe as a mill journal, a series of composition notebooks, the cheap black and white kind from the drugstore, their covers worn and their spines taped. There were 16 of them spanning from 1987, the year after they married, to the month before he died. She pulled the first one down. His handwriting was the same as always. careful, a little cramped. The letters of a man who had been taught to write by someone strict and had never quite relaxed. The first entry was dated March 1987. Started on the crown wheel today. The old one was beyond saving. Sourced new white oak from the batten's place. The gear ratio is off by about 3 degrees from the original spec. Will need to recut. Mavis had not known there was such a thing as a crown wheel. She read on. The early notebooks were technical. Measurements, materials, calculations, the language of a man working out an engineering problem across years. But here and there between the specifications were other things. Notes that had nothing to do with millstones or gear ratios. June 1989. The picket boy came by again. 8 years old, walks down from the hollow because the school bus doesn't run this far out. Showed him how the water wheel works. He stayed 3 hours. His mother sent a jar of beans to pay for it. Didn't take it. Told her to keep the beans. October 1991. Had a group of kids from the county school. Teacher named Mrs. Farrow brought them out for a history lesson. Ran the stone for them. Ground a cup of corn. You would have thought they had never seen anything made by hand. Maybe they hadn't. August 1993. A family from the trailer park at the edge of town came and asked if they could use the grinding stone. They'd grown a small crop of corn. Didn't have money. Ground it for them, took all afternoon. Good corn. Mavis set the notebook down. She picked up another from the mid-90s, then another from the early 2000s. The technical notes grew shorter as the years went on. The mill was becoming what it was supposed to be, and the work became maintenance rather than restoration. But the other notes grew longer. The pattern of the mill she began to understand was this. Harlan Doss had spent the first decade bringing the building back to life, and then he had spent the next 2 decades figuring out what that life was for. People came. Not many, and not always, but they came. Families who wanted to grind their own grain and couldn't afford the gas to drive to the commercial mill in the next county. School teachers who wanted their students to understand where flour came from before supermarkets made the question obsolete. An old man from the hollow named Cresswell who had grown up watching his father use a mill just like this one and who sat on the stone floor for 3 hours one Saturday afternoon just to hear the sound of the wheel turning again. He didn't say much. He just sat and listened. And when he left, he shook Harlan's hand for a long time without letting go. Harlan wrote it all down. Not the way a businessman records transactions, but the way a person records the things they don't want to lose track of. Each entry had a name, a date, a detail small enough to be overlooked and specific enough to be true. March 2001. Brought the whole family out. Mother 4 kids, the oldest maybe 12. Ground 2 pounds of cornmeal. The youngest had never seen corn before. It was a chip. I don't know what to do with that. But I know what the mill can do with it. November 2004. A woman came alone. Didn't say her name. She stood at the door for 10 minutes before she came in. She said her grandfather had worked at a mill like this one in Georgia when he was young, and she had always meant to see one and kept not getting to it. She ground a small bag of wheat herself. I showed her how to feel when the tension is right. She cried a little. I didn't say anything. Some things you just let be. Mavis read until the light changed in the building and she realized she had been sitting on that bench for over 3 hours. She had come out here expecting to find a foolish hobby. She had found 31 years of quiet purpose she had never been invited to see, partly because she had never asked, and partly she was beginning to understand, because Harlan Doss had not known how to show it to her without making it a thing she had to feel grateful for. He was not a man who wanted gratitude. He wanted the wheel to turn. That was all. Before we go any further, and I promise you, what happens next is the part that changes everything. If a story like this means something to you, if you believe that the things we build and deserve to be remembered, please take a moment right now to subscribe to Grand Stories and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. 1 comment, 1 city, 1 name. It is the same thing Harlan Doss did every time he wrote a name in those notebooks. It is a way of saying, I was here, and this mattered to me. Now let's go back to Mavis in that mill on Cutter Creek. On the 4th day she spent at the mill, she had begun driving out every morning without quite deciding to. Mavis noticed the boy. He was about 10, standing at the edge of the tree line on the far side of the creek, watching her. Not with the furtive look of someone trespassing, but with the particular stillness of a child who has stood in that exact spot many times and considers it his rightful place. He was thin, his jacket 2 sizes too large, and he had a way of holding himself very still that she recognized without being able to name. She raised a hand. He raised one back. Then he went on standing there. His name, she learned from the woman who ran the post office, was Eli. Just Eli. His grandmother, who was raising him, went by Mrs. Tapp, but the boy had his mother's last name from before, and people had gotten used to Eli. His grandmother drove the school bus for the county and was gone from 5 in the morning until nearly 4 in the afternoon. And Eli, who had no school on Wednesdays due to some county budget arrangement Mavis did not understand, spent those days largely on his own. He had been coming to the mill on Wednesdays since he was 7 years old. Harlan had taught him how to oil the gears, how to check the wheel paddles for rot, how to read the water level on the creek gauge. Harlan had built into the stone wall beside the wheel. The boy knew the mill, Mrs. Tapp told her later, the way other boys know video games, by instinct, by the particular love that comes from being shown something by someone who matters to you. Harlan had written about him. She found it in the 9th notebook, October 2017. The Tapp boy started coming regularly. He is 7 and he does not talk much, but when he is interested in something you can see it in his whole body. Today I showed him how to read the water gauge. He asked me why. I told him because the wheel needs the right amount of water, and if it gets too much it throws the gear out of true, and if it gets too little it slows to a stop and doesn't do anything for anybody. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, so the water has to be just right. I told him that was exactly it. January 2018. Eli came even in the cold. I had not expected that. He helped me pack insulation around the north wall. Didn't complain about the cold once. Didn't talk much. But when we were done he said, it sounds different in here when the wind can't get in. I told him that was why we did it. He nodded like that made sense to him in a way that mattered. Mavis sat with that notebook for a long time. Then she went and unlocked the door and left it standing open for the first time. The next Wednesday, Eli came across the creek. He stood in the doorway first, the same stillness as before, and she understood that this was his way of asking permission rather than assuming it. She gestured toward the workbench. He came in. He went straight to the gear housing on the east wall and checked it, ran his fingers along the teeth of the crown wheel, the way you'd check a familiar thing for change, then looked at the water gauge through the window and nodded to himself, apparently satisfied. Then he looked at Mavis. He showed me how to do that, he said. It was not a question. I know, she said. I read it. He looked at her for a moment, deciding something. Then he said, he used to say the wheel doesn't care who turns it, it just wants to turn. Mavis had no answer for that. But she understood, standing in that mill with the sound of the water wheel coming through the walls, that this boy had received something from her husband that she had not, and that this was not a reason for resentment. It was a reason to stay. She started grinding again that November. She did not advertise it. She put a handwritten notice on the board outside the post office, and another on the bulletin board at the feed store on Route 9, and one more on the board at the small library that no one seemed to use but everyone seemed to read. Doss Mill on Cutter Creek. Open Saturdays. Bring your grain. She added her phone number. She had no idea whether anyone would call. They called. Not many at first. 3 families in November, 5 in December. But then in January, a woman named Bessie Wren from the county extension office called and asked if the mill would be willing to host a demonstration for a group of students doing a local history unit. Mavis said yes before she had time to think about what yes would require. She spent the week before the visit oiling every moving part and asking Eli on his Wednesday whether she was doing it right. He watched her work for a while, then gently corrected the angle of her oiling cloth on the gear teeth, the way a person corrects something when they cannot quite help themselves. She let him. He was right. She was still learning what Harlan had spent 30 years knowing, and the learning was slower than she wanted it to be, and better than she had expected. The first Saturday, a stranger drove all the way from the next county, a man named Walt, who ground wheat, and stood for a long time watching the wheel turn, before he said anything. He said his father had been a miller in North Carolina, and he had not thought he would ever see a working wheel again, and he had not realized until that moment that it mattered to him that it still existed. He did not pay her anything. He shook her hand and drove home with 3 pounds of whole wheat flour, and left on the workbench a carved wooden wedge that Mavis recognized. It was the same kind the man at the funeral had left on Harlan's grave, a miller's wedge. A thank you with no words. She put it on the shelf above the workbench, next to the notebooks. Then, one morning in early March, a man arrived at the mill before she did. His name was Garrett Stull. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a city coat that had never seen a mill, and he drove a company truck the color of money. He waited by her truck, hands in his pockets, and when she walked up he introduced himself pleasantly, gave her a card, and offered his condolences for Harlan. He worked for a development group. Stull did not say which one by name, but the logo on the truck said Meridian something. She could not read it in the early light. And they had identified the Cutter Creek corridor as an ideal location for a private recreational development. A series of upscale cabins and a managed fly fishing operation for paying clients. The ideal location for the centerpiece of this development, he told her, was the bend in the creek where the mill stood. He told her the number. $60,000 for a parcel appraised at 0. Mavis looked at the number. She was not a woman who pretended math was not math. $60,000 was real. It would fix the roof of the house. It would put something behind her for the years ahead. It would give a 58-year-old woman alone in Kentucky something she had not had in 11 months, which was a reason not to lie awake at 3 in the morning counting things. Garrett Stull watched the number do its work in her face, and he waited with the patience of a man who had seen this before and knew how it usually ended. He did not press. He only said that the mill, charming as it was, wasn't really viable as a going concern, was it? And that the land, properly developed, would bring genuine economic benefit to the region. Mavis asked him to give her some time. He said, of course. He smiled. He drove away. That night, Mavis sat at the kitchen table with the business card and the composition notebooks, and she let herself think about it honestly. She had not been born into money, and she had not married into it, and she had worked every year of her adult life, and still ended up at a table with $211 in the bank and a bill for the furnace that she had not yet opened. No one had any right to tell her that $60,000 was not real, was not important, was something a practical woman could simply turn away from. She let herself want it. She sat with it the way you sit with something you know you should not have, and feel it fully before you decide. And then she thought about Eli. She thought about a 10-year-old boy who walked across a creek every Wednesday, because a man had shown him how to oil a gear and listen to water. And she thought about what Garrett Stull's managed fly fishing operation would do with a 10-year-old boy who did not have $60, let alone the price of a day's access to a private creek. She thought about the woman who had cried grinding wheat because her grandfather had worked a mill in Georgia. She thought about the old man named Cresswell who had sat on the stone floor for 3 hours listening to the wheel. There was a line in the 6th notebook she had not been able to put down. She had memorized it without trying to. You cannot appraise what a thing is to the person it's for. You can only appraise the timber and the stone. The rest of it has no price because it was never for sale. She closed the notebooks. She looked at the business card. Then she thought about the covenant document she had not fully understood and realized she had better understood it before she made any decision at all. The county courthouse was open Thursdays. She drove in the next morning and asked for Vernon Ashe, who had been the county land registrar for 22 years, and was the kind of man who took genuine pleasure in explaining how things worked to people who needed to know. She showed him the covenant document. He put on his glasses. He read it through. Then he set it down on his desk and looked at her over the top of his glasses with an expression she would think about for a long time. I remember when Harlan filed this, he said. He came in here himself. April 2009. Sat in that chair you're sitting in. He tapped the arm of the chair. He had the language written out himself, had a lawyer help him. But the idea was his. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. What does it mean? Mavis asked. For the mill. What does it mean right now? Vernon Ashe took off his glasses and set them on the document. It means, he said, that your husband placed the Doss Mill property under a permanent historic operating covenant dedicated to the purpose of public access and working demonstration of traditional grain milling. It is recorded in the county land registry. It is irrevocable. It is held in trust by the State Historic Preservation Authority. He paused. What it means for your Mr. Stull and his $60,000 is that he cannot buy what has already been given. The mill cannot be sold for private development. It cannot be converted. It cannot be closed to the public so long as there is someone willing to operate it. He looked at her directly. Harlan made sure of that 14 years ago. Mavis sat still for a moment. The sound of the courthouse clock was very loud. He never told me, she said. It was not an accusation. It was just the fact of it sitting in the air between them. Vernon Ashe nodded slowly. He said something about that, actually. I asked him if he was going to tell his wife. He said, The registrar paused, looking for the right words. He said, "Mavis carries enough. I'm not putting one more thing on her to carry. I'd rather the law carry it, and let her carry whatever she chooses to carry." He picked his glasses back up. He was protective of you in a way he didn't have a language for. That was my read of him. Mavis looked at the window. The courtyard outside was bare and bright, the October trees stripped down to their bones. For 14 years she had been protected by something she could not see, could not feel, had not known existed. For 14 years, Harlan Doss had been sitting at that mill on Saturdays, turning the wheel, writing the notebooks, teaching a boy to check the water gauge, and building, quietly, without a word, a wall, around a thing he loved, so that when the day came that someone tried to price it, the price would already have been set, and it would be beyond anything Garrett Stull, or anyone like him, could carry in a company truck. Now I want to stop for just a moment, because what comes next is the part of this story that I believe you need to hear all the way through. If you've made it this far, please take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It takes 5 seconds and it tells us that stories like this one, the ones about the things built in silence that outlast every price tag, are worth telling. All right. Back to Mavis. Garrett Stull came back as men like him do. He brought different papers this time. He brought a lawyer and a surveyor and the language of eminent domain, the state's right to acquire private property for public use with fair compensation. He used the phrase public recreational benefit 4 times in the first 10 minutes, in the pleasant, patient tone of a man who has learned that repetition feels like reason. Mavis waited until he finished. Then she set the covenant document on top of his papers. His lawyer picked it up. Read it again. Then he said something to Stull in a low voice that Mavis could not hear but did not need to. Stull looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, he did not look pleasant. "This was filed in 2009, he said, as if maybe she had not noticed the date. "I know," she said. "You were unaware of it." "I was," she said. "I know more about it now." He tried. She gave him credit for trying. A man should try when he believes he is right, and Stull believed in his arithmetic the way some people believe in a thing that has never let them down. He talked about the economic potential of the corridor. He talked about jobs. He talked about the county tax base. Each of his arguments was true in its own way, in the narrow way that things are true when you measure only the things that fit on a spreadsheet. And then he made the same kind of mistake that men like him almost always make. He looked around the mill, at the old stone floor, the patched walls, the composition notebooks stacked on the shelf, and he said that he understood the sentimental attachment. He really did. But sentiment did not grind grain, and the mill as a viable operating facility was. "Grinding grain," Mavis said. He stopped. "It ground 240 pounds of cornmeal in November," she said. 60 in December. "I have a school group coming in February and 3 families on the books for March." She looked at him steadily. "The mill is operating. The covenant requires operation, and the mill is operating. And the covenant is permanent. Your lawyer read it." The lawyer, who had been quiet for several minutes, nodded once, just barely, but Stull saw it. There was a long silence. The water wheel turned outside. The sound of it came through the stone walls, slow and patient, and entirely indifferent to the conversation inside. Stull looked around one more time, taking the measure of the room the way men like him always do, searching for the price, the angle, the number that unlocks any door. He did not find one, because Harlan Doss had spent 14 years making sure there was none to find. Before he left, Stull paused at the door. He looked at Mavis in her work coat, at the composition notebooks on the shelf, at Eli standing by the gear housing watching with the stillness of a child who is not afraid because he has never had reason to be afraid in this particular room. "Why?" he said, not unkindly. He genuinely wanted to know. "It's a mill. It's an old mill on a flooded road. Why does it matter this much?" Mavis looked at him for a moment. Then she said what was true. "Because my husband spent 30 years making sure someone would still know what flour was before it came out of a bag. And because there is a boy in this room who can read a water gauge and knows why it matters, and there was nobody who taught him that except my husband, and the only place they could do that was here." She picked up the covenant document and held it so Stull could see the date. "He knew you were coming. He just didn't know your name." Stull left. He did not come back. The cabin development, she heard the following year, had been built at a different bend of the creek, farther south, on land that had no covenant and no wheel and no boy standing at the edge of the tree line on Wednesday mornings. The Doss mill stayed. Spring came to Harlan Falls the way it always does in Kentucky. Grudgingly at first, and then all at once, the redbuds going pink before the leaves were even thinking about it. The creek running high and clear through the bend. Mavis and Eli had spent the winter shoring up the east wall and replacing 2 of the wheel paddles. And she had learned, by the time the water came up with the spring melt, how to read the creek gauge herself without asking. Eli still checked it when he came on Wednesdays, but he checked it differently now, not to report to Harlan, but to confirm what he already knew, the way a person checks a clock they trust. People came on Saturdays, more of them as spring went on. Some drove an hour. A woman from Lexington brought her elderly mother, who had grown up watching a water wheel turn in her grandmother's county, and had believed for 40 years that they were all gone. The mother stood at the door and then sat down on the stone floor, the same way the old man Cresswell had sat, and listened to the wheel without saying a word for 20 minutes. Her daughter stood beside Mavis and did not say anything either. Some things Mavis was learning, you just let be. She found, toward the end of March, one more thing in the notebook she had missed. In the back cover of the last composition book, the one that ended in July, the month before Harlan died, he had written something that was not a mill entry, and not a technical note. It was in a different place on the page than his usual hand, as if he had written it at a different time, by a different kind of light. Mavis has never come out here. I have never asked her to. She has her way of holding things together, and the mill is mine, and I thought it was better to keep those separate. I still think that, but I wonder sometimes if she would see it. Not what it costs, which is what I have always known she sees, because she has had to see it because one of us had to, but what it does. The wheel turns. Someone goes home with flour. Someone's kid knows where cornbread starts. Somebody old sits on this floor and hears the sound of something that isn't gone yet. I wonder if she would see it and think, all right, I understand now. I wish I had thought to ask her. Mavis read that page 3 times. Then she set the notebook down on the workbench, on top of all the others, and she went and stood in the doorway of the mill, with the April light on her face, and the sound of the creak and the wheel coming up through the floor into her feet. She would not apologize to him. He would not have wanted an apology. He would have waved it off with the particular patience of a man who did not keep score, who had written down other people's names for 30 years, and never written down a debt. She would only say what was true, that she had come out here, and she had read every notebook, and she had kept the wheel turning, and she understood now what it was for. She thought he would nod at that, the way he always nodded, briefly, with his eyes already moving back to the work, because being understood had never been the thing he was after. The thing he was after was that the wheel kept turning. In the months that followed, Mavis Colton kept the mill the way Harlan Doss had kept it. Open on Saturdays, the notebooks maintained, the water gauge checked every morning, the names recorded. She added a new composition book to the shelf, navy blue instead of black, and she wrote in it the same way he had, a date, a name, a detail small enough to be overlooked and specific enough to be true. April 12th, a family drove from Bowling Green, 2 adults, 3 kids, ground the wheat themselves. The youngest called the water wheel a water clock. Said she was going to tell her teacher. I told her she should. May 3rd, Eli showed a younger boy how to check the gear housing. Did not ask permission or explanation, just showed him. That is how it starts. Eli did not leave. He came on Wednesdays all through the spring and into summer. And Mavis taught him what she was still learning, how to replace a worn paddle before it failed, how to adjust the millstone gap for different grains, how to read the creek in the early morning when the water was planning something. She was not as good at it as Harlan had been. She told Eli that plainly. He said she was getting better. He was not wrong. People in town grew accustomed to seeing the truck outside the mill on Saturdays, to the slow turn of the wheel through the trees when you drove down County Road 7. A few of the older residents, she discovered, had known about the mill for years without ever saying so, had known that Harlan Doss kept it going, had driven past it on their way somewhere else, and understood without being told that the wheel was turning because someone had decided it should. Wendell Cresswell, the old man's son, came down one afternoon with lumber he said he'd been planning to bring for 10 years. He built new shelves along the north wall, more space for the notebooks, and a small bench by the door so that people who came to listen could sit down properly. He took no money. He shook Mavis's hand and left, and on the new shelf he had put, without mentioning it, a small carved wooden wedge. She put it next to the others. What Garrett Stull had failed to understand was not the covenant, though he had failed to understand that too. What he had failed to understand was the accounting. He had come to a mill with no market value, and he had counted the timber and the stone and the water rights, and his number had been $60,000. But the mill's accounting was of a different kind. The kind that takes 30 years to read and does not fit on the back of a business card. It counted a boy who knew how to read a water gauge. It counted a woman from Lexington who sat on the stone floor and wept for a sound she thought was gone from the world. It counted 3 pounds of cornmeal in the hands of a family who had grown the corn themselves and not been asked for anything in return. It counted a notebook on a shelf with a name on every page. Because Harlan Doss had believed that a thing witnessed deserved to be written down, and a thing written down does not disappear when the man who wrote it does. That accounting would never fit in a spreadsheet. It was not supposed to. It was supposed to go on the shelf next to the others in order, with a date and a name and a detail small enough to be overlooked and specific enough to be true. Mavis Colton understood that now. She had understood it since the morning in April when she stood in the doorway of the mill with the light on her face and the wheel turning below her, and she had opened the navy blue notebook to the first clean page, and she had picked up the pen. The wheel does not care who turns it, it just wants to turn. And the only thing it asks of the person standing beside it is that they keep a record of where the grain went, and make sure that when someone comes along who needs the flour, the door is open and the stone is running, and the water in the gauge is exactly right. Mavis kept the door open. She kept the stone running. And every Saturday morning she drove down County Road 7, with the trees coming in close on both sides and the creek smell rising through the window. And she was no longer a woman driving towards something she resented. She was a woman driving towards something she understood, which is not the same thing as peace, but is close enough to it that on most mornings she could not tell the difference.